In a small, peaceful village nestled at the edge of a vast forest, there lived an elderly woman named Rose. She was known by everyone for her kind heart and love for animals. Rose had spent her whole life caring for the creatures of the wild and tended to her garden, which was often visited by birds, squirrels, and rabbits. Her life, though simple, was filled with love and connection to nature. One bright autumn morning, Rose was out in her garden, tending to the flowers she had carefully planted over the years. The sun was just rising, casting a warm glow over the earth. As she bent down to prune a rosebush, she heard a soft rustling sound coming from the edge of the forest. At first she thought it might be a deer or perhaps a family of raccoons. But when she turned her head, her eyes widened in disbelief. There, emerging from the dense thicket, were 3 tiny bear cubs. They were no taller than a garden shovel, their fur a mix of brown and black. They were wobbling and unsteady on their feet, looking lost and confused. They didn't seem afraid of Rose at all. In fact, they were curiously sniffing the air as if drawn to her. Rose knew instantly that something wasn't right. It was unusual for bear cubs to be on their own, especially at such a young age. They were likely separated from their mother, and without her protection, they wouldn't survive long in the wild. Rose's heart ached for the little creatures. Without hesitation, Rose stood up and walked slowly towards the cubs. She knew she had to act quickly if they were going to have any chance of survival. The cubs didn't run away or try to hide. Instead, they seemed to sense that Rose meant them no harm. One of the cubs, the smallest of the 3, even nudged her leg as if asking for help. Rose gently scooped up the little cub, cradling it in her arms, while the other 2 cubs followed closely behind her. They didn't resist. They simply trotted along beside her, trusting her in a way that was almost uncanny. Rose, though small and frail herself, had a quiet strength that came from years of working with animals. She wasn't afraid, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She took the cubs inside her cottage, where she set up a warm, cozy space for them near the fireplace. She boiled some water and prepared a mixture of honey and milk, hoping it would be enough to nourish the hungry cubs. The 3 of them settled down, curling up together as Rose kept a watchful eye on them. She knew it was going to be a long road ahead. The cubs needed time to regain their strength, and she would need to care for them day and night. Over the next few weeks, Rose devoted herself entirely to the cubs. She fed them, kept them warm, and made sure they were always safe. She even built a small pen outside for them to play in once they were old enough to explore. But despite her best efforts, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The cubs were growing stronger every day, but they weren't entirely themselves. They seemed to miss something, perhaps their mother or the forest that had once been their home. One evening, as Rose sat on her porch watching the sunset, she heard a noise coming from the woods. It wasn't a typical sound. It was deep and resonant, the sort of noise that only an adult bear could make. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be the cubs' mother? Had she been searching for them all this time? Without a moment's hesitation, Rose stood up and rushed to the edge of the forest, calling the cubs to follow. The cubs, now stronger and more agile, bounded after her, their tiny paws making soft thuds on the ground. They reached the forest's edge, and just as Rose stepped into the trees, she saw her. A large, brown bear emerged from the shadows, her eyes scanning the area. She was looking directly at Rose, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. The bear took a few cautious steps forward, and Rose held her breath. The 3 cubs, now standing beside her, began to call out to the bear in a series of chirps and growls. The moment the bear heard their calls, her eyes softened. She lowered her head and sniffed the air. Then, in a surprising display of affection, she walked over to the cubs, nuzzling them one by one. It was clear that this was their mother. Rose could hardly believe it. She had never seen a wild bear show such tenderness. The bear mother turned to Rose, her gaze filled with gratitude. Rose stood still, her heart swelling with emotion. She had given the cubs a second chance at life, and now their mother was back to take them home. The bear mother stepped forward, gently brushing against Rose's legs as a sign of thanks. Rose reached down, touching the bear's fur with a trembling hand. For a moment, everything was still. The cubs, now reunited with their mother, looked up at Rose as if to say goodbye. They had grown strong under her care, and now it was time for them to return to the wild, where they truly belonged. Rose watched as the family of bears turned and made their way back into the forest, their figures slowly disappearing into the trees. But that wasn't the end of the story. A few days later, as Rose was tending to her garden again, she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned to find the 3 bear cubs standing at the edge of the clearing, their eyes locked onto hers. They hadn't forgotten her. The cubs didn't hesitate this time. They approached her slowly, their paws making soft sounds on the ground. Rose knelt down, smiling warmly. The cubs, now bigger and stronger, nudged her gently. It was as though they were thanking her once again for the love and care she had shown them. From that day forward, the cubs and their mother would visit Rose regularly. The cubs would play in her garden, sometimes chasing the butterflies or rolling around in the grass. The bear mother would stand by, watching her cubs with a protective gaze, but always keeping a respectful distance from Rose. It was as if they had formed a bond that could never be broken. The villagers began to notice these visits as well. At first they were startled, but soon they realized that the bears were harmless. They came to understand that the elderly woman had somehow earned the trust of the wild creatures around her. As the years passed, Rose grew older, but the bond between her and the bears never faded. The cubs, now fully grown, would still come by from time to time. Their visits became a symbol of the deep connection between humans and the animals they share the world with. And so, in the heart of that quiet village, Rose lived out her days surrounded by the creatures she had always loved. The bears, in their own way, had repaid her kindness, by bringing their family to her, by showing up to visit, and by reminding her that even the wildest of hearts could be touched by love. As for the cubs, they had never forgotten the woman who had saved them. They didn't just repay her with affection, they repaid her with their loyalty and friendship, which is something even the strongest of animals reserve for those they truly trust. Rose's kindness had come full circle, as the bears not only found their way back to the forest but kept her in their hearts forever. The story of the elderly woman and the 3 bear cubs spread throughout the village, becoming a legend of compassion and the beautiful bond between humans and the wild creatures that share our world. The wind howled, a savage beast tearing at the ancient pines that clung to the mountainside. Rain lashed down, a relentless torrent that turned the forest floor into a muddy river. The sky, a bruised purple, was rent by jagged streaks of lightning, each flash illuminating the chaos that had descended upon the remote wilderness. Deep within the heart of this tempest, a small, dilapidated cabin stood defiant, its weathered walls bearing witness to countless storms. Inside, Elara, an elderly woman with eyes as deep and knowing as the forest itself, sat by the hearth, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows on her wrinkled face. She had lived alone for decades, her life intertwined with the rhythm of the wilderness, her heart attuned to the silent language of the trees and the creatures that roamed beneath them. A sudden sharp cry pierced the roar of the storm, a sound so fragile and desperate that it cut through Elara's seasoned indifference. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and reached for her worn oilskin coat and a sturdy lantern. The cry came again, closer this time, and a sense of urgency seized her. She knew that sound, a sound of fear and vulnerability, a sound that spoke of helpless young ones in peril. Elara ventured out into the storm, the lantern beam cutting a narrow swathe through the darkness. The wind threatened to snatch it from her grasp, but she held on, her determination fueled by the urgency of the cries. She followed the sound, her boots sinking into the sodden earth, her breath catching in her throat as the cold rain stung her face. The cries grew louder, and then through the veil of rain she saw them, 3 small huddled forms, shivering and whimpering beneath the skeletal remains of a fallen tree. They were bear cubs, no more than a few months old, their fur matted and soaked, their tiny bodies trembling with cold and fear. Their mother, likely caught in the storm's fury, was nowhere to be seen. Elara's heart ached for the vulnerable creatures. She knew that without her intervention, they would not survive the night. She carefully approached them, her voice soft and soothing, speaking words of comfort in a language they couldn't understand, but could feel in the gentle tone. She gathered them into her arms, their small bodies surprisingly heavy, and cradled them close to her chest, trying to impart some of her own warmth. They were terrified, their eyes wide with panic, but as she held them, their whimpers subsided, replaced by soft, trembling breaths. She knew she had to get them back to the cabin, to warmth and safety. Elara carried the cubs back to her cabin, her movements slow and careful, mindful of their fragile state. She laid them gently on a thick blanket near the hearth, the warmth of the fire quickly enveloping them. She fetched a soft woolen cloth and began to gently dry their fur, her touch soothing and reassuring. The cubs, exhausted and chilled, huddled together, their eyes watching her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Elara prepared a warm, sweet concoction of honey and milk, a remedy she had learned from her grandmother, a time-honored recipe for nurturing the young and weak. She offered the mixture to the cubs, and they lapped it up eagerly, their tiny tongues working with surprising vigor. As they drank, their eyes began to brighten, their bodies relaxed, and a sense of contentment settled over them. Elara watched them, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She knew she had saved them not just from the storm but from certain death. She would care for them until they were strong enough to fend for themselves, a task she undertook with a quiet sense of purpose. Days turned into weeks, and the cabin became a haven for the rescued cubs. Ilara nurtured them with unwavering care, providing them with food, warmth, and affection. They grew stronger, their fur becoming thick and glossy, their playful energy filling the cabin with a joyful chaos. They followed Ilara everywhere, their clumsy paws patting after her as she moved about her daily chores. They would play in the cabin, wrestling and tumbling, their playful growls and snorts echoing through the small space. Ilara taught them the ways of the forest, showing them which berries were safe to eat, how to find grubs beneath the bark of fallen trees, and how to track the scent of their prey. She spoke to them in her gentle voice, sharing stories of the forest, of the creatures that lived within it, and of the ancient spirits that guarded its secrets. The cubs, in turn, seemed to understand her, their eyes following her every move, their ears perked to catch every word. A bond formed between them, a connection that transcended language, a silent understanding that spoke of gratitude and affection. Ilara, who had lived alone for so long, found her heart filled with a warmth she had thought long gone. The cubs were her companions, her family, her reason for waking each morning. As the cubs grew, their gratitude manifested in ways that surprised and touched Ilara. They would bring her gifts from the forest: a perfectly formed pine cone, a smooth river-worn stone, a handful of ripe berries. They would follow her on her walks through the woods, acting as her protectors, their keen senses alerting her to any danger. They would sit with her by the hearth, their warm bodies pressed against her, their soft fur providing comfort on cold nights. One day, as Ilara was tending to her garden, she noticed a strange commotion in the woods. The cubs were agitated, their eyes fixed on a spot in the distance. She followed their gaze and saw a large, male bear, its eyes fixed on her, its posture aggressive. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this bear was a threat, a predator that could easily overpower her. But before she could react, the cubs sprang into action. They charged at the larger bear, their small bodies a blur of fur and claws, their growls echoing through the forest. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even Ilara, their loyalty and gratitude fueling their courage. The larger bear, taken aback by the ferocity of the cubs' attack, retreated, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. Ilara was stunned. She had been saved by the cubs she had rescued, their gratitude repaid in the most profound way possible. The cubs continued to grow, their bodies becoming larger and stronger, their instincts urging them to explore the wider world. Ilara knew that the time had come for them to return to the wild, to live the life they were meant to live. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both joy and sadness. She had grown to love them as her own, and the thought of parting with them filled her with a sense of loss. But she also knew that they were ready, that they had learned the skills they needed to survive, that they had a place in the vast wilderness that surrounded her cabin. One morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, Ilara led the cubs to the edge of the forest. She spoke to them, her voice filled with love and pride, telling them to be strong, to be brave, to remember the lessons she had taught them. The cubs looked at her, their eyes filled with understanding, their bodies radiating a sense of quiet strength. They nuzzled her hand, their warm breath brushing against her skin, a silent farewell. Then, with a final glance, they turned and disappeared into the trees, their figures fading into the shadows of the forest. Ilara watched them go, her heart aching but also filled with a sense of peace. She knew they would be all right, that they would thrive in the wilderness, that they would remember her, the old woman who had saved them from the storm, the woman they had repaid with their unwavering gratitude. Ilara returned to her cabin, the silence now more pronounced, the absence of the cubs a tangible presence. She missed their playful antics, their warm bodies pressed against her, their gentle growls and snorts. But she also knew that they were out there, living their lives, free and strong, a testament to her kindness and their gratitude. The forest, once again, was her sole companion, but it was a companion she understood, a companion that held the echoes of the cubs' presence, the lingering scent of their fur, the memory of their playful energy. She continued her life, her days filled with the simple rhythms of nature, her heart warmed by the memory of the cubs, the grateful cubs who had shown her the true meaning of companionship and the power of love. The wind still howled, the rain still fell, but Ilara was no longer alone. She carried within her the bond she had forged with the cubs, a bond that transcended the boundaries of species, a bond that spoke of the enduring power of compassion and the profound gratitude that blooms in the heart of those who have been shown kindness. The forest in its own way remembered too. The whispering pines, the babbling brooks, the ancient stones, All held the memory of the grateful cubs who had found sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness, and who had repaid their debt with a love that echoed through the ages.